Good.
Okay.
Arlene Bernholtz from Laguna. Welcome.
Well, we're doing great. We got 2 more signups today, 373 now.
Wow,
Yeah.
that's great. Wancho, how you doing? Glad you like the shirt.
Are we doing trivia tonight?
We are.
Okay.
Eric, good to have you aboard again. Ken Jessen, nice to see you. Doug, always good to see you from Mill Valley. I remember our ski days up in Crested Butte. And you being the CEO over at Aspen Mountain. And Fiji Water. And a number of other great things.
All right. It's 7 o'clock. Let's get started, shall we? Thank you, everybody, for being here this evening. Thank you, Duane, for being here once again. I want to remind everybody that you can make donations to support this program, as well as to support a scholarship to a local student. We're giving out a scholarship. Once this is all over, we're going to figure out all the details, but the more money that you guys donate, the more money that we can give to a local student to help them go to college next year. You can make those donations at crestedbuttemuseum.com. Again, crestedbuttemuseum.com, and you'll find all the links that you need. This session is being recorded, as have all the rest of them. You can find these all on the homepage of crestedbuttemuseum.com. If you just go to the homepage and scroll down a little and look in the right-hand column, you'll find all the links there. That'll take you to our YouTube channel. We also have a number of other videos on our YouTube channel that I recommend you check out. There's really fun videos there. Please consider becoming a member to support the museum. You will also get a newsletter from us. You also get quarterly updates in the mail and all kinds of fun stuff. Members are the first ones to find out about everything going on. You also receive all kinds of membership discounts. For example, we're doing walking tours right now, and those members get discounts for our regular walking tours. We are holding those regular walking tours every Tuesday and Thursday at 9 a.m. and every Saturday at 3 p.m. We have our last themed walking tour this Saturday, and we're almost out of space. I think there's only like 1 or 2 spots left. But it's all about railroad history with Russ Lawyer. Let's see, what else do we need to tell you guys about? Oh yes, closed captioning. We started using closed captioning by request a couple sessions ago. The closed caption has been very interesting, but it seems like it's been helpful so far. If you guys have a horrible problem with the closed captioning, be sure to let me know. Otherwise, enjoy kind of the goofy words that come out of it. It gets the main point across, is from what I can tell. More on videos. This year's film festival is featuring 2 local history documentaries. One is called High Country by Red Lady Films. We are a fiscal sponsor for those guys, and they've done amazing work with creating a 45-minute video all about the mid-timers, about the 60s and the 70s, and how this community completely changed with that influx of new people. The second one is called Birth of Dirt. It's all about the history of mountain biking in Crested Butte, and it's another short film that's very fun. So be sure to check out Crested Butte Film Festival. Both of those videos include photographs from the museum archives. I know High Country includes an interview of Duane. I think, does Birth of Dirt include an interview with you too, Duane?
Uh-huh.
It sure does. All right. You're just all over the place. It's great. Finally, we've got trivia again tonight. After last week, we really realized that by saying you can only respond to all panelists and attendees, it really left out people that may not have the computer savvy that other people do. So when you guys respond, please respond in the chat any way that you can. So just because you guys don't see somebody else's answer doesn't mean it's not there. So again, respond any way you can in the chat, and whoever's first, whether you can see it or not, is going to win the trivia prize tonight. All right, Duane, take it away.
Thank you, Nell, and welcome everybody. Thanks for being aboard. I want to give a little plug in for what Nell was talking about with that ski film with Connor Hagen and Ali Batwin. It's excellent on Crested Butte in the 60s and the 70s in a real changing time. And then also a great mountain biking film. And I'm going to give you another video I'd like to have you folks keep in mind. The name of the video is Race Across the Sky. And it's about the Leadville 100. Dave Wiens from Gunnison is a world champion mountain biker, won the Leadville 100 5 times in a row, and then beat Floyd Landis, the Tour de France champion, the following year. And then he beat Lance Armstrong, the 7-time Tour de France winner, the following year after that. And Race Across the Sky talks about the race between Armstrong and Wiens after Lance Armstrong beat Dave the following year. So a little plug there. Next week, we talk about one of the most unique towns in America and the #1 marble town in the world, located at the north end of Gunnison County, and that's Marble. And we're going to have a few words to say about Crystal, which is nearby. That is where the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, the Lincoln Memorial, the Washington Monument, 400 public buildings came from. So that's next week's topic. Now, the trivia question, whoever gets it today will get a copy of the book, which I'll put up on the screen here. And it's called Around Gunnison and Crested Butte, one of the books that I did. This one came out in 2008. So here is the trivia question, first come, first serve. Within 2 days, I want you to tell me the average frost-free day historically in the Gunnison Country. In other words, this is the day when there is no frost at all. So I'll give you 2 days either way. And you can think about that and then come on in and hit Nell. All right, today we're going to talk about farming and sustainability in the Gunnison Country, and I'm going to add a few personal notes here. Historically, in the Gunnison Country, it was believed that you couldn't raise crops because of the high elevation and the short growing season and the cold weather. Tonight, we're going to find out that that was not true and is not true today. Now, I grew up on a dairy farm in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, and now we raise Black Angus on it. It's not a dairy farm anymore. And I'm going to give you a few personal comments along the way about farming as we talk about farming and sustainability in the Gunnison Country. Now, I'm going to tell you a quick story about when I first came to Gunnison in 1962. And I'm in my office right now, same office I was in 58 years ago, and a rancher who had been a coal miner from Crested Butte named Gene Grary cleaned up our building. And I got to know Gene real well because he always cleaned up at night. And I asked him one time, I said, Gene, how come there's so damn much sagebrush around here? I'd never seen sagebrush before in Michigan because we had all kinds of water. And Gene's exact words were, water kills sagebrush. Well, not being from the West and not knowing anything at all about the importance of water out here, I thought what he meant was there was poison in water that killed sagebrush. 3 years later, I'm walking down the main street of Gunnison thinking about this, and I hit myself up the side of the head and I said, I got it. If you have water and you have rain, you're going to get grass and not sagebrush. So it took me 3 years to become a man of the West, but I finally got it. And that's what we're going to talk about today. The Gunnison Country opened up to white settlement with the coming of the Gunnison Cow Camp at Dos Rios in 1868. And that cow camp was put in there to supply beef for the Indians of the Los Pinos Indian Agency. And it also began to open up 6 years later when Sylvester Richardson brought in 20 people in the Gunnison colony. Richardson, who had been here the year before on a geological expedition with the Dr. John Parsons group, had hoped to settle a great farming area which he thought had plenty of water and many valleys. However, shortly after he got here, he came to believe that the Gunnison Country only had a 70-day growing season, and historically that went from, I'm not going to mention it because that might tip you off on the frost-free day, but only 70 days. Lou Easterly, a pioneer rancher on Ohio Creek in the 1870s, said this: "In the early days, only hungry-looking sagebrush, mesas, and valleys covered with weeds and willows could be seen. With farming seemingly out of the way, early settlers took up ranching, and they cleared sagebrush and willows, and they put in tremendous work in digging irrigation ditches, which led to great hayfields on either sides of the rivers." Now you get a good idea. You look at that picture and you see all the sagebrush that was here. And along the rivers, you had all kinds of willows. The Gunnison Country had mild winters from 1875 to 79. Now there's another picture of, this is right where the Taylor Dam is today, right where that bridge is in the left-hand corner of your picture. And that's the Taylor River coming through Taylor Park and en route to Taylor Canyon and Almont. And that whole area in the background there, before it was irrigated, I mean, it was willows and sagebrush. The winters from 1875 to 79 had been very mild, but a tremendous winter in 1879 and 80 forced cattlemen to provide for their cows by putting in cattle sheds and barns. Now this is a good picture of a 4-horse team and a guy with a plow in the background digging an irrigation ditch in Taylor Park. And I can guarantee you all those irrigation ditches you see today did not come without tremendous amount of hard work. It was now obvious after 1879, in that last tough winter, that winters would bring heavy snow and cold weather, and that cattle couldn't graze during the winter months. Now, I mentioned in a previous episode the great Texas cattleman Clyde Goodnight in 1862 drove longhorns into the Gunnison Country to see if he could get more open range. When he came back the following spring, all 200 of them were dead. Not one survived the very difficult winter. Many people in the 70s and the 80s, and many people today, believe that farming was and is not possible, but we are going to find out, as I said earlier, that that is not true today. They were wrong then, they're wrong today. Before the arrival of the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad in 1881 into Gunnison, and the Denver, South Park, and Pacific into Gunnison the following year, the Gunnison Country had to produce its own food and be sustainable. You didn't have a city market or a safe way to go to stock up on supplies. You raised your own. Meat and milk were available immediately with beef cattle and milk cows. Those cows were driven in from Denver and Texas. By 1910, the Gunnison Country had 300 ranches, 40,000 cows, 10,000 horses, 1,000 hogs, and 200 mules. And one rancher, William Snyder, ran 2,500 cows from Marshall Pass in the east all the way to Sawtooth Mountain in the west, and that involved the most cows that any rancher ever had in the Gunnison Country. By 1899, 1,000 milk cows in this area turned out 175,000 gallons of milk every year. 45,000 pounds of butter was made and sold at 25 cents a pound. Creameries began almost immediately. The Gunnison Creamery was located on South Main Street, right between the Rio Grande and South Park Railroad tracks, and turned out 1,000 pounds of milk a day. The Ohio Creek Creamery at Castleton, near the head of Ohio Creek, handled 1,800 pounds of milk a day and produced cheese and butter used locally, as well as some of it was shipped out. The Howville Creamery at Jack's Cabin, north of Gunnison, which had a dairy and a milk house, produced 75 pounds of butter a week. John Baum, a German rancher up Ohio Creek, supplied many of his neighbors with butter. One day, one of them, Harry Cornwall, went to the Baum Ranch in the dead of winter to pick up a month's supply of the butter. John Baum took Cornwall to an outside shed where the butter was kept. Cornwall noticed a peculiar shaped something covered with burlap and lying on a bench next to the butter. When Cornwall asked John Baum what that was, Baum said, and I quote, "Oh, that's my wife's cousin. He died last week and the ground is froze too hard to bury him, so we wait until spring. He will keep all right this winter." Cornwall was shocked, and he declared in his memoirs, "The butter was on a shelf just above the wife's cousin. I took it, but I didn't need any of that butter until that box was used up." Many ranchers had milk cows and produced their own butter. Sam Fisher, who had been the founder of Almont Ranch, now was where Ohio Creek entered the Gunnison River, turned out 30 pounds a week. In 1887, a newspaper column stated, and I quote, "E. Stevens, the great butter maker of the Cochetope, is in Gunnison with his golden bricks." Ice was also a very needed and essential commodity in the Gunnison Country. Now there we have people sawing ice on the Gunnison River to put in blockhouses. Now when I teach my world history class, I always ask my students why spices were the #1 expensive trading commodity in the world, much more expensive than gold and silk and silver. Some get it, and that was because before refrigeration, spices, and I'm talking about salt, pepper, ginger, and cinnamon, were a preservative of food. That's how you preserve food before refrigeration. So you had to have ice, and the Gunnison Country had it, and they had the Gunnison Valley Ice Company, which began in the 1880s, a mile and a half southwest of Gunnison along the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad tracks. It had several ponds, the largest of which was 5 acres, and it harvested 5 crops of ice every year, sawing it out into blocks, as you can see in that photo. In 1887, the ponds produced 25,000 tons of ice, with 10,000 tons going to the Denver and Rio Grande. Another ice pond was a half-mile southeast of Gunnison, again along Denver and Rio Grande Railroad tracks. This pond, like the other one, was 5 acres, had 2 ice houses. Water was turned in October, and 5 crops were harvested, the last in March. A railroad car was located every 30 minutes during a 24-hour period, and the ice shipped out. An 1884 newspaper account said this: "Most of our ranchmen are located near a stream from which it is a short, cheap job to fill individual ice houses for summer comfort and profit. Many businessmen in Gunnison, Pitkin, Crested Butte, and smaller towns have their own ice houses." Fish were also a great food source, both from catching them in streams, and Gunnison River was one of the top 3 trout streams in the world. In the 1960s, Sports Illustrated included a little article about a fish by the name of Geronimo, a rainbow trout that hung out near Cooper's Ranch west of Gunnison. And a newspaper account said that that fish probably weighed 500 pounds because of all the fishermen who said that they had hooked it and then lost it, and all the lures that were in that fish's body and mouth made it weigh about 500 pounds. The great story of Geronimo. There were a lot of suckers in the Gunnison River in those days, and about twice a year they would put seines, S-E-I-N-S, in the river, and they would take out about 1 to 1.5 tons of suckers twice a year, and ultimately got rid of all of them, so we don't have suckers today, and I grew up with them on my farm in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. 2 big ponds were put in 1937 just north of Gunnison on the George Anderson Ranch. 100,000 5 to 10-inch rainbows were planted. Bright lights were installed over the ponds to attract insects to feed the fish. H.A. Decker had a 520-acre ranch near the base of Crested Butte Mountain and named it Hillside. He had a big fish hatchery there with a 30-acre lake. It was known as Lake Grant then, and it was stocked with trout in the 1890s. Decker shipped out 2,000 pounds of trout a year at 30 cents a pound, with much of it sold locally. Meat markets were also big business in the Gunnison Country after this area opened up. Joe Block had a major meat market on Elk Avenue in Crested Butte, and Charlie Stevens an even bigger one in Gunnison. In 1879, Stevens had a corral about 100 feet square on the corner of Main and Tomichi. He rented out a building 30 feet by 30 feet and he started his meat shop there. One observer said this, and I quote, "Charlie did the biggest business in town outside of Jim Kelly, who had a saloon on the opposite side of the street. Customers would line up 50 to 100, waiting their turn to buy beef in the early morning, keeping the meat cutters busy." In 1907, J.D. Miller put in the Elkhorn Slaughterhouse, 2 miles north of Gunnison, near the mouth of Ohio Creek with the Gunnison River. Now, I don't have a picture of that, but this is the slaughterhouse at Slaughterhouse Gulch, about 2 miles outside of Tin Cup. And that wheel is how they raise the beef in the slaughterhouse. The beef killing room at the Elkhorn Slaughterhouse in the Gunnison Country was 18 by 35 feet, and the hog killing room was 20 by 35. Miller's main building was made out of stone. Potatoes were another big business in the Gunnison Country from the start, with almost every rancher producing them and having a root cellar to store them. The Haymaker family had a 400-acre farm on the east side of the Gunnison River, 7 miles north of Gunnison, about where the Lost Canyon Ranch is today. That family used a water turbine to pump Gunnison River water 200 feet from the river onto a mesa on the east side of the stream, with the water rising 75 feet en route. They then irrigated 400 acres and shipped out so many potatoes that the Denver and Rio Grande was forced to build a spur there, and they called it Haymakers on the early maps. The Haymakers had 15 to 20 men working picking potatoes by 1911. They got about 340 bushels to the acre. 2 digging machines pulled by 4 and 6 horse teams were busy. The men put the potatoes into wire baskets and then, when filled, dumped them into burlap sacks along the rows. Now, I said I was going to interject a little story or two here. When I was on the farm as a young kid, we raised potatoes a few times, and I could pick 140 of potatoes a day, and 140 is a quarter of a mile. And I remember putting them in that wicker basket, and then about 3 wicker baskets to the burlap sack. You tie the burlap sack, throw it off to the side, and keep picking. And I got a lot of respect for the Mexican-American people and the immigrants who picked strawberries and lettuce out in California. That is back-breaking work. And it made me realize I probably wasn't cut out to be a farmer. The potatoes were then, at the Haymaker place, put into a root cellar 55 by 35 feet and 8 feet high, and then transferred to railroad cars. By October, 300 tons had been picked, and 2 railroad cars loaded up periodically and shipped out. A man named William Major in 1881 raised 20,000 pounds of potatoes on his ranch 5 miles up the Taylor River, on what later was the Elsinore Ranch and which is today the Wilder Ranch. The legendary Potato Henry Rudolph of Powderhorn was also a big producer. His average yield was 200 bushels to the acre, with each acre bringing in about $100. Great crops of potatoes were also raised on 14 ranches above Antelope Creek, just west and above Gunnison, and also at Doyleville, 17 miles to the east. They were also raised at Vulcan, 15 miles southeast of Gunnison, with irrigation water coming from Willow Creek. North of Gunnison, a 50-acre field was planted at the base of Flat Top Mountain, and nearby rancher Henry Trampy also had a great potato crop. However, by the 1920s, with World War I over, demand fell off, and that, along with high expenses, some early frosts, and low prices, marked the end of the Gunnison Country potato industry. In the 1880s, grain became big business in the Gunnison Country. Matt Arch was the first guy to bring in a 6-horse threshing machine in 1887, and he was the first to harvest the grain. Now, another personal note. When I was on the farm, we had a Bell City threshing machine. And a threshing machine separates the grain from the straw, and it blows the straw out into a pile, and then you can either bale it or keep it loose. And my job was to have burlap sacks, 2 of them, on 2 funnels that came down. And when the grain filled up one burlap sack, you'd throw it off to the side and trip it, and then the grain would fill the other burlap sack, and you'd put an empty sack on the other side. My father and I, every morning, took 1 hour to grease and oil that threshing machine, Bell City. Some of the belts, we had 37 belts. Some of them were twisted and some weren't. And I always regretted that we didn't hang on to that damn Bell City threshing machine. It'd probably be worth a lot of money today. Herman Albright got a 10-horse threshing machine in 1897 to harvest much of the grain up Ohio Creek. And after 1900, several monster machines were kept busy. Rancher George Crawford raised wheat on top of Flat Top Mountain in 1921, and he got 23 bushels to the acre. He brought the wheat by horse and wagon down to the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad below. 20,500 bushels of grain were cut in 1906. 4,000 were barley that was used in the Gunnison and Guthiel breweries. Now, in the San Luis Valley today, they got a special kind of barley that they raise for the Coors Beer Company out of Golden, and they make pretty good money. Many ranchers had grinding mills to grind the grain into feed for the cattle. We had one on our farm, and I can tell you it was very dusty. The one man who was most responsible for Gunnison County farming was a New Yorker who came to Irwin, the great silver camp, when the mining boom was going full blast in 1880. When the boom faded, he took up a ranch on Ohio Creek the year later in 1881. His name was George Cornwall, and he was the first to prove that vegetables could be grown here and that farming could succeed. Very few had ever tried to raise vegetables, assuming that the altitude and the cold weather and the short growing season made it impossible. Cornwall, however, had had a garden in New York, where he was from, and he was determined to plant one on his ranch. What followed was written about by his son, mining engineer Harry Cornwall, who had also come to Irwin and at first did very well in the mining boom. Harry left us a 100-page memoir, which I have, which included his father's attempt at farming and to grow vegetables along Ohio Creek. Harry wrote that after sarcastic and hilarious prophecies from ranchers of the Gunnison Country that the New Yorker was crazy and that he didn't understand the mountains, Colorado, or the Gunnison Country, the garden was nevertheless started. The results were stunning. Folks said Harry Cornwall came from 20 miles away to see the garden before they would believe its success. Harry Cornwall wrote, and I quote, "Father raised potatoes as big as eggplant. along with peas and beans and lettuce and all vegetables except corn, pumpkins, squash, and cucumbers, which would not develop because of the cold nights. After George Cornwall's success, every rancher of the Gunnison Country planted a garden. Cornwall went on to start the first Gunnison County Agricultural Fair, which became very popular every fall. And at that fair, the following crops were exhibited. I'll see if I can say it with one breath. Probably not. Potatoes, beets, turnips, carrots, oats, rye, timothy, onions, parsnips, beans, cabbage, lettuce, cauliflower, taking a breath, celery, radishes, butter, artichokes, currants, tomatoes, and watermelons, all were exhibited. Women showed off their pies and cakes and preserves. The Gunnison County Agricultural Fair was the predecessor to Cattleman's Days, which didn't begin until 1901. Wild raspberries picked on Marshall Pass and near Gunsight Pass and Crested Butte were also displayed. But perhaps the best raspberry area was near Mount Carbon, not far from Ohio Creek. One picker recalled, and I quote, "The hillside looked like it had a blanket of red." Now, when I moved up on my farm in 1944 with my parents, my mother and I would go out and pick blackberries, raspberries, gooseberries, and hazelnuts. I always tried to outpick my mother, but I never could. And what she would do is can the blackberries and the gooseberries and the raspberries. And in the wintertime, every night for supper, we had blackberry shortcake, raspberry shortcake, or gooseberry shortcake with a little bit of cream on top, and I still wish I could have it again every night. Gooseberries were picked just west of Gunnison and not far from Tomechi Creek, and they, like the raspberries, were canned and used during the winter months. Amazingly, strawberries were raised at Sargent's, 32 miles west of Gunnison and at 8,477 feet. Now there's a picture of a strawberry planter put in by Will Hicks in the 1930s. Now I'll tell you a little story about this. I'm giving a talk to the stock growers about 25 years ago. I showed this picture and I said, if anybody can tell me what this is at Sargent's, I'm buying them 2 6-packs of Heineken's. And I said, George Means can't answer, because he lived right near Tomechi Creek, not far away, and I knew he knew. And nobody could answer that question. Rancher Roy Hicks built a strawberry planter. You're looking at it. He built it using an Alice Chalmers garden tractor, the engine in the rear. Roy drove it and his daughter rode on the back and placed the plants on the planting belt. It planted beds as they drove. Go back to, there we go. There's the daughter, I think, on the Alice Chalmers. The strawberry was big and had great flavor. Roy's son, Will, took the strawberries on the Denver and Rio Grande train into Gunnison, and he sold out in 1 hour on the corner of Main and Tomechi. My dad told me on our farm that when he was a young man, the kids would pick blackberries and sell them for 25 cents a quart to the railroad that ran right by our farm. Ranchers Clarence and Iva Lehman reminisced about ranching on Ohio Creek before the turn of the century. Iva Lehman declared, "People always raised big gardens and had milk cows and chickens. Besides cattle, we also had 5 to 10 milk cows. My mother would make and sell butter and canned raspberries for extra money. You had to have all those things just to live." Another unusual crop was raised in 1933 and for a few years after, 7 miles east of Gunnison: mushrooms. For years, rancher Ed McGuffey raised them on his ranch and yearly harvested a commercial crop. Sugar beets were also raised commercially. The McCormick family had several acres near Mullen Lake along the Gunnison River, not far from the Palisades Rock Formation and the current nursing home today. In 1901, ranchers at Cimarron raised cabbages up to 40 inches in circumference. A major crop in the 1920s and 30s, when times were tough, was lettuce. The lettuce was raised along Marshall Creek near Sargent's. So much was raised that 2 and 3 railroad cars were filled every day. Rancher Elvira Templeton recalled, and I'm quoting, "We raised and shipped head lettuce for years, but the deer and porcupine damaged the head so bad we stopped raising it except for our own use." Bob Clifford also had 10 acres of lettuce 3 miles west of Gunnison, right on the other side of Rancher Lee Span's ranch today. One of the best farming areas in the Gunnison Country was at Jack's Cabin, 16 miles north of Gunnison. The Jack's Cabin Valley had 3,000 acres of irrigated farmland, and in 1912 produced 5,000 tons of hay and great crops of strawberries, potatoes, cabbage, onions, lettuce, peas, and radishes. Hay was also a paying crop in the Gunnison Country, and you're looking at the great Cloverleaf Ranch of Steve Waters, east of Gunnison by about 22 miles. And this is in the 1940s or 1950s. With irrigation, ranchers almost always had a good crop and made a lot of money when drought hit the often non-irrigated eastern slope. By 1915, Gunnison Country ranchers raised 80,000 tons of hay, with half sold outside the area. Now there is one of about 7 different kinds of hay stackers, and this one is located up Ohio Creek. In dry years elsewhere, hay sold at $100 a ton. Now that's a lot of money around 1910. In good rain years, ranchers got $20 a ton. In 1884, unbelievably, a year of great drought, Gunnison ranchers sold hay at the unbelievable price at that time at $240 a ton. That, ladies and gentlemen, would be like $2,000 or $3,000 a ton today. Even at high elevation, over 9,000 feet, farming was successful. William Buckley had a ranch over that elevation on Mill Creek, and he raised potatoes and turnips and rutabagas and carrots and parsnips successfully. Now I just put this picture up there to show you how you got goods in and out of the Gunnison Country when the railroad didn't run right by your place. This is how you did it, a 4-horse team. By the mid-1880s, Gunnison considered a tannery and a plant for the manufacture of soap and candles and oil of tallow. The Gunnison Country had many hides from cattle and bear and elk and deer and wolf and mountain lion, and it was felt that furs could be tanned here cheaper than 1,000 miles away. However, the tannery never got off the ground. There's another good example of how they carried produce. This is going from White Pine to Sargent's in the wintertime to the railhead. You got a sleigh and a 4-horse team. From the earliest days in the Gunnison Country, ranchers had chickens and turkeys and geese, along with 2,000 hogs. The eggs and the meat were sold to restaurants in Gunnison and other towns. Now, on our farm, we had chickens, and I would come in. I don't eat eggs today very often. When I would come in from the barn after milking my cows, my job was to go in the chicken coop, and I would have a little stick, and I would put it next to the hen's head so she wouldn't pick me. And then I'd reach underneath, and I would get an egg that was wet. It had just been laid. I was used to eating fresh eggs and not eggs that you get from Safeway today. My mother also was the best maker of bread, homemade bread I ever saw. And you could smell it for 50 yards away. And we had a mailman named John Jockala. We were on the rural route. And I don't know how the hell that he knew it, but he could smell that bread, I think. So he would take the mail and walk it into my mother. And this was the conversation that went on for 35 years with neither party admitting they knew what was going on, even though they did. John Jockala would say to my mother, Ruby, I thought I'd bring the mail in for you today. And my mother would say, well, thank you, John. Could I interest you in a loaf of bread? And John Jockala would say, don't mind if I do. This conversation went on twice a week for 35 years. In Crested Butte, dandelions were picked in the summer and turned into delicious dandelion wine. Another unique crop raised here was honey, bees. The great clover in the hayfields led some to have beehives. Bees were raised on the Lee Spann Ranch west of town and on the Ralph Walker Ranch north of town. Angelo and Anna Marie Grary began raising bees in 1992. They eventually had 24 hives and 80,000 bees, and they turned out 3/4 of a ton of honey a year, much of it sold locally to individual customers and stores. The hive stayed outside and at 95 degrees. The bees kept the queen warm at that temperature by rotating around in the hive. When aerial spraying for mosquitoes began in the 1960s, it unfortunately killed many of the bees, leading the owners from the San Luis Valley and Montrose who had them here to take them out. Today, with no aerial spraying and no intermittent clover in the hayfields, bees are once again a possibility in the Gunnison Country. Absolutely essential to farming and ranching in the Gunnison Country was the coming of electricity by the late 1930s and the early 1940s. Electricity came here because of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, which produced the REA, or the Rural Electric Association. Gunnison and Crested Butte had electricity before the 1930s, but none of the rural people in between, because there wasn't enough of them to make electricity profitable for electric companies. A great book, The Men Who United the States, talked about what had gone on before electricity. And my father told me it was the greatest invention the farms ever had. And I'm quoting now from The Men Who United the States. Because there was no electricity, a farmer could not use an electric pump. He was forced not only to milk, but to water his cows by hand, a chore that, in dry weather, meant hauling up endless buckets from a deep well. Because he could not use an electric auger, he had to feed his livestock by hand, pitchforking heavy loads of hay up into the loft of his barn, and then stomping on it to soften it enough so the cows could eat it. He had to prepare the feed by hand because he could not use an electric grinder. He would get the corn kernels for his mules and horse by sticking ears of corn, hundreds of ears of corn, one by one into a corn sheller and cranking it for hours. Because he could not use electric motors, he had to unload cottonseed by hand and then shovel it into the barn by hand, to saw wood by hand, by swinging an axe or riding one end of a ripsaw. Because there was never enough daylight for all the jobs that had to be done, the farmer usually finished after sunset, ending the day as he had begun it, stumbling around the barn, milking the cows in the dark, as farmers had done centuries before. Washing, ironing, cooking, canning, shearing, helping with the plowing and the picking and the sowing, and every day carrying the water and wood. And because there was no electricity, having to do everything by hand by the same methods that had been applied by her mother and grandmother and great-great-great-grandmother before her, because there was no electricity. That's why it was the greatest invention of them all. So the Gunnison Country made do in the days when it had to be self-sufficient, before the coming of the railroad and even after. The Gunnison Country today could be much more self-sufficient than we are. But we are getting there. And I talked to M.J. Pickett yesterday, and here's what we're doing today in the Gunnison Country. 7 commercial producers of food and many individuals have gardens. The producers produce enough food to feed 1,000 families and sell a lot of the produce on weekends in Crested Butte and Gunnison at the farmers market. The major vegetables raised today include garlic and tomatoes, potatoes, carrots, leeks, mustard, broccoli, cabbage, cauliflower. And fruit that is raised includes raspberries and strawberries. And they also raise pigs and goats. We have today water, rich soil, sunshine. For every 1,000 feet of elevation, you can add 1 degree of temperature. So if it's 88 degrees here, it's really 96 because we're almost at 8,000 feet. We have more science today. And since 1990, our growing season has averaged 78 days, up from 70 before. Now, I have a great affinity for what I've just told you, because on our farm, we were self-sufficient. My job was the garden, and there wasn't a rock or a weed in that garden. And to this day, I still like raw tomatoes, raw potatoes, raw onions, raw peas scooped out of the pod. They were great days. We had our own cream, we had our own milk, we had our own beef. We also had something called blood sausage. My dad would bring a heifer in, shoot him in the head with a .22. I would slit the throat, catch the blood in a pan, take it to my mother, and the coagulated blood would be put in with a little bit of meat and potatoes and onions, and it came out blood sausage. Enough. I thank you very much for tuning in. I'm on the chat box. The first thing we're going to ask if anybody got the correct answer.
So I misunderstood the question and put the wrong question in the chat box, I think. Could you
I'll give you the question again.
Yeah.
The average day of the year historically, when there is no frost at all during that day.
All
And
right.
get on the chat box now. I'm on the chat box. So get on the chat box, everybody.
First guess came from Mike Burns with August 12th.
Wrong.
Next one.
Charlottesville.
The next one is from Michael Guerreri, May 14th.
Wrong.
Next one from Sam, April 26th.
Wrong. Average frost free now.
Next one is from Sarah, June 15th.
That's a little closer.
Next one from Eric Phillips, May 18th.
Wrong.
Next one from Jim, 16th of August.
Wrong.
Next one from Steve, May 5th.
Wrong.
Next one from Barbara, July 22nd.
Wrong.
Kathy, July 4th.
Wrong.
Lisa, June 11th.
Wrong.
Cheryl, May 15th.
Wrong.
Sheila, May 11th.
Wrong.
Christopher, May 20th.
Wrong.
Oh, sorry, July 20th.
Wrong.
Eric Phillips, July 28th.
Wrong.
Judy, August 10.
All right, I'm going to give you a hint. It is in June.
Okay. All right, so we can skip August. From Mary, June 15th.
Wrong.
Jolene, July. That's July. Okay, so next one is Charles, June 10th.
Wrong.
Bob said July. Kenneth said July. Ann said May.
It's in June.
Lindy says Father's Day.
What day is Father's Day?
Oh, I think last year.
That's got to be about the 15th or 16th. No.
Yeah. Next, May's out. Sean, June 10.
Wrong.
From Ann, she guessed June 10 too. Rombar guessed May.
It is later than June the 15th.
It's later than June 15th. Okay, Dominic with June 20th.
Wrong.
Mary Haven says, well, probably June 15th to August 15th. The average growing season is 60 days.
Wrong.
All right. Doug with July. Charles with June 10th. We already ruled that one out. Kenneth with July.
After June the 15th.
Kevin with
Jolyn,
July.
how you doing?
We got Fathers. We got June 10th again. We got July. Jolyn with June 17th.
Wrong. It's later than June 17th.
Dominic with June 20th.
Wrong.
Phyllis Guerreri's guessing September 1st. But
No, it's in June.
We got lots of June 20th, June 18th, June 30th from Kenneth.
There we go. It's June 28th. Within 2 days, who got it?
Kenneth Jessen.
Okay, Ken, get Ken's address.
All right.
Are there any questions that anybody has? And thank you all for getting on the chat box. Get some more on the chat box. I'd love to see who you are.
All right, so Kenneth, I'm going to shoot you an email unless you shoot me one first.
Yep.
Kenneth,
Are there any questions anybody has?
oh my goodness, we got lots of messages. Kenneth was the first one to it. Okay. Any questions, you guys, about tonight's presentation?
Thank you for your kind comments, everybody.
Karen asks, she's curious about the history of Jack's Cabin.
Yeah, you know, Jack's Cabin was a halfway point on the Barlow and Sanderson stage in the middle 1870s between Gunnison and Crested Butte. And a guy named Jack Howe was the guy who had a cabin there. And one day a woman came, and they said when that woman came, Jack went out the back door and was never seen again. Probably was his wife or ex-wife. Mike, Nell, you might be able to help. Do Allie and Connor have a title for the 60s and 70s movie?
They finally do. It's called High Country.
High Country, Mike.
Mm-hmm. Kathy says, tell us more about blood sausage. Cook, taste, what's it like?
I'll tell you what, I'll come to blood sausage in just a second. Sarah Cosin, County Road 13 is called Slaughterhouse Road because if you go towards the end of that road, that was Vern Harris's ranch, and that is where the slaughterhouse was for the Gunnison area. One of the slaughterhouse places. That's where they slaughtered the cattle and the hogs. Blood sausage was delicious. And what we would do is clean the intestines out and put it inside the intestines, so that's why it was sausage. But you could not eat very much of it because it was very rich. I had an uncle who thought it was great, and when we told him what it was, he went out and he threw up.
Gross. Let's see. So you
Yeah, Michael, Gene Greary, you bet. Gene was a great friend of mine. Any other questions?
Mike is asking if the 60s and 70s movie is available to watch. Mike, if you go to the Crested Butte Film Festival website, they're doing it all virtual this year. So you can watch it from anywhere in the world. So be sure to register for the film festival so you can see that movie.
Yeah, Mike, thank you for the, Mike Perry, thank you for the comment on John Tolles. I remember John, and I didn't know he had bees up Ohio Creek, so thank you for that.
And Eric has shared the link to the High Country film trailer in the chat. So if anybody wants to watch the trailer, it's there in the chat. Thanks, Eric.
I've seen a lot of that. It is tremendous. And a lot of folks were around in the 60s and 70s. And of course, that was a time when you had the ski crowd, the old miners or the natives, and then all those long-haired hippies that came in that at first had a big division with the old miners, and then they began to get along. And you also had the trust funders. So it's quite a mix.
Thanks for sharing your address. I've got it.
Tempe Snyder, why weren't there any trees compared to now? Because of the aridity of the place. Didn't have a whole lot of water. Dr. John C. Johnson talked about planting all the trees that are now around Western Colorado University. You know, that's why you go out on the Great Plains, they got about as much water as we do here. So unless you're along a river, or unless you carefully cultivate the trees, you're not going to have them. And that's why you don't see hemlock stands or maple forests out on the Great Plains. Same reason. Any other questions? Well, I thank all of you for being aboard. Nell, stay on for a second as we get off. Don't forget, Marble next week. You'll like it.
All right, I got Kenneth's address, so I just sent that to you. It'll be in your email.
Oh, good. How many do we have aboard today?
We had 98 today.
Very good. How many registered?
We're up to 373.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Yeah.
All right, everybody. Thank you. Michael, thank you for the kind words, and thanks everybody for being on board. I'll see you later. See you, Nell.
We'll see you, Duane. Thanks so much.
You bet.